very frequently, it has been portrayed that love belongs to the senses instead of reason. I want to say that this question is a non sequitur, because it's not an either or. I would say that, for instance, someone like Plato, in his tripartite conception of the soul, he thinks that emotions, and love is one of the emotions, are sort of a third category. And the question is whether reason is going to guide the emotions or the urges are going to guide the emotions.
I quite like that conception. I don't like a lot of Plato, but I would say that love is an instinct which is kind of an indicator to pursue a higher ideal. So it's not, this is where I think we need to maybe parcel out like infatuation and love. And I think the three being too distinct today trips people up, because you feel like you have to go on this particular arc from, I have to like you for a certain amount of time, and then we do this will we won't we period, and then we commit to love. Whereas before, people would reach the love stage a lot faster, be much more open about their feelings, and have more lifelong relationships. I think love is some kind of magnetic attraction to someone that is not purely sexual. You feel very overwhelmed by how compelling they are. It's kind of an enchantment, and I've heard Carl describe this. It's almost like when the light beam shoots out of your chest in Donnie Darko and connects you to somebody. You feel like you're being pulled along by the golden thread that Ariadne's leading you out of the maze with, right? Yeah. And so I think that is a kind of signpost to pursue something that is more meaningful than just sex or conversation. I think it does occupy that third category.
No, I agree with you. And I want to say that this is where love and the idea of our narrative and our self-conception connect. Because there is this question as to when we encounter emotions that we may initially think to be love or may come to think of as love. There's a question as to whether this emotion pulls us away from the senses, or away from the senses alone, or it pushes us down to the sensory level alone. And this is an interesting thing to explore, because I want to tie this with what you were saying about culture, and whether we live, I think we do live in a culture of sensationalism.
Yes.
That tries to bring everything down to the level of the senses. And I think that there lies there a sort of fear of our nature. Our nature does contain tragic elements, and I think that they are universal themes of our narratives. They are common to every human being with a developed cognitive system, or with a developed mind. That's the way I prefer putting it. But it seems to me that deep into this cultural animosity towards, let's say, our non-sensory nature is, how should I say, is a sort of animosity towards consciousness. And we see this in all sorts of trends, especially, for instance, antinatalism.
I think actually, and I'm going to upset the audience again with this, but I see this as the hyper-pornification of culture is kind of a sedative for sexuality, actually. Because if you think about eros, most people think of eros as just erotic love or sexuality. No, there is a romantic element tied into that, and that's something that C.S.Lewis says, which I'm sure I'll mention later. The pornification means that you're not falling in love with a subject, which is equally autonomous. And it's mainly because a subject can lead you astray and they cannot reciprocate your love. You are literally only falling in love with objects that provide you gratification. So you're isolating yourself and you're bringing yourself down purely to the level of sensory pleasure, and you're extricating consciousness, because it's very painful to become conscious of not only your own inferiorities that mean you can't get a partner, but also that your partner, the hypothetical partner, would be conscious and could betray you. So I do think it's much a cultural problem of not just the availability of it, but because we don't have the toolkit to parcel out our emotions. And again, we've got those stages of infatuation, like, and love, rather than just understanding what love properly is. People retreat to things like pornography or the gratification of the crowd on social media, rather than switching your phone off and having a genuine conversation with a loved one. That, I think, is a real problem for women these days, because they crowdsource affirmation rather than getting it from one person as their protector and provider.
I think we should focus on the idea of an animosity towards consciousness. And I think Nietzsche has something interesting here, and I don't usually agree with Nietzsche, but I think that this point is good that he raises. He talks about the Dionysian element in The Birth of Tragedy, and he's talking about this idea of intoxication. He talks about there being two cultures that were honored in ancient Greece. One is the Dionysian culture that focuses very much on worshipping god Dionysus by drinking excessively and basically lulling your senses and basically getting drunk and altering your state of perception. And a more Apollonian sentiment that is more focused on reason and order.
This synchronizes very much with something that Carl was talking about a little while ago, and I'm sure he's going to do a podcast on this. It's something that also came up in our Simone de Beauvoir podcast, is the Julius Evolar's conception of the lunar feminine, the telluric, the down to earth, so descending into pleasures, and the solar masculine, which is looking upwards, aspiring towards a higher ideal, conceiving of yourself in the present and pursuing what is above you. And so the Apollonian path is much more noble, and it actually constrains those Bacchic, Dionysian, telluric efforts, which are more sensory and pleasurable, and is something you should involve in. Otherwise you become a disconnected ascetic, going completely away from the earth entirely. But you need to mediate it with your higher ideals. And
Nietzsche, I think, says something really revealing psychologically when he talks about the Dionysian element. It says that this element, the main mindset of this element is that the worst thing is to be alive, and the next worst how did he say it? The best thing is to die soon.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, please. But
that sounds like the nihilistic undercurrent of all socialism, because most socialists are incredibly nihilistic, like Beauvoir, who hated her own existence and wanted to depopulate the earth. So if you can't get socialism, which is this utopia of utter abundance where you go without want, which suppresses the screaming of your inner conscience to know that you're not enough, as opposed to that solar ideal, then we might as well just rip it all up anyway, because if we can't have perfection, we might as well be dead. Just let it all be over, because you won't know if you're dead anyway, will you?
So I think we have done a good job in portraying this distinction between the sensory level of human existence and the non-sensory, or the one that drives us upwards. And I do think that, as we said, that many cultural trends that are sensationalist, they do try to bring us down. And in bringing us down, they're trying to make us turn our backs towards our consciousness. And there's a deep fear in dealing with the main aspects of our narratives.
The telluric is so earthly, it will literally bury you.
So I think we should move forward in drawing the distinction between two questions. One is the ontological one, what is love? And the other is the recognitional question. How do we recognize whether a particular emotion that we feel constitutes love? Now, I think we should start with some basic notions and basic distinctions when it comes to love. Then we will move to theories of love, and then we will leave the recognitional question for later. So, some things about love. I think that we should draw a distinction between many kinds of love. And for instance, we talk about romantic love, we talk about sexual love, we talk about love towards our family members, or love towards our friends, love towards activities, love towards our country. If you haven't watched our Symposium on patriotism, please watch it. It's really interesting. So there are many objects of love, and depending on the object of love, we may speak of a different kind of love. But very frequently, there are people who try to portray love as only lust. What do you think of this?
I think it's wrong. So C.S.Lewis, speaking purely on the object or patriotism conception, C.S. Lewis in The Four Loves, which is a fantastic book, by the way, anyone should read it. One of the things he says is that there's a profoundly unselfish and very conservative instinct in actually loving objects. Don't make idols out of them. You should always have your love contrasted in relation to the solar ideal. His conception is, of course, God as emanator, because he was a Catholic. But the idea that he had was, if you as a wine connoisseur taste a wonderful claret, and you identify the taste. You know proportionately who to give the claret to, because you shouldn't cast your pearls before swine. You shouldn't waste good wine on people that don't have a taste for it. But you also want to ensure that the distilleries still run, that the tradition of barreling appropriately is still done. You have a whole chain of events which brings you quality goods. So in positing a hierarchy of values, you to acknowledge the quality, and then acknowledging that you want to sustainably repeat the experience in future, and also share it with others. There's an unselfish instinct of conservation that you are doing your part in consuming something of worth and passing it down the chain of civilizations. So it's not a purely selfish instinct, and it's not purely lustful, because if we have love even towards objects and experiences, that is pleasurable, yes, but it also has a social dynamic. And then you have all those different conceptions of love that the Greeks came up with xenia, which I hope I'm pronouncing right, is hospitality. That's a purely unselfish love, kind of, because of course you want the good social feedback. But if you're constructing a good dinner party and facilitating a good time, that's nothing to do with your own gratification. Then you have philautia, which is the foundation of self-love, which isn't what you think it means. Get your minds out the gutter. It's that instinct for self-development that makes you worthy of earning a lifelong partner. And then you have storge. I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
I think it's affection.
Yeah, that's affection between family members, specifically parent and child. And that's definitely not lustful. And also, it's not rational, because you can never... This is the problem with the social contract conception. It is silly to think of purely voluntary bonds, because the way we come into the world is entirely involuntary. And so even though you as a parent have an obligation to act so lovingly that if your child could have chosen which parents to come into the world with, they would have picked you, you still have that bond that isn't based on transactional terms or rational terms or just base impulses. It's based on a need, but the need isn't to be stigmatized. There's still a deep love there.
I want to say something about what you said about the Greek conceptions. So many people forget that one of the perhaps the major influence in our thinking today about ancient Greece is Aristotle.
Yes.
And Aristotle draws frequently distinctions between kinds of things. Before Aristotle, Plato had this idea of the forms. And he thought that love, or eros, as he was talking about, was one thing, one transcendent idea that was common in all sorts of relationships and all sorts of instances. And this has caused a translational problem, because it seems on the one hand that he doesn't distinguish the way that between kinds of love, the way that Aristotle does. But it's an anachronism to charge him for it, because in a way, Aristotle developed his theories in opposition to Plato by being influenced by him. And on the other hand, this neglects the idea that Plato was not talking about eros in one sense. Or he was talking about one transcendent idea, but we could say that he thinks that there are instances of such an idea in all sorts of contexts.
Yes.
And there is frequently this word erastis in his words, and it's in his Platonic dialogues, which is translated as lover, and very frequently people translate it in a sexual way.
Yeah.
And Platonic love is entirely not about sexual love. So it's interesting when we come back to the text, or when we visit the text for a first time, to bear this in mind, that he is not talking about one kind of love, but he has one word for it. It's Aristotle who helped us see this. And there are translational issues. He's not talking about sexual love. So when he talks about people being lovers of Socrates, and Socrates being a lover of these people, in the word erastis, it doesn't mean that he was sexually and having sexual intercourse with them.